Good evening, LBE fam. We're so happy to have you join us for yet another LBE community dialogue. We're missing this evening our resident facilitator, now our new councilwoman here in Flagstaff, Northern Arizona, Kara House. So in her absence, we are pleased to welcome back again. I call them the fabulous duo, Sister Doctors Mary Roaf and Treya Allen. Sister Mary is in California, and my dear sister Treya is right down the hill here in Arizona. And so we're coming to you with another, I think it's somewhat of a hot topic. I'd like to first of all dedicate this segment to Sister Stacey Yvonne Abrams, my Sarah over there in Atlanta, Georgia, who made a run for the second time for governor of Georgia and again did not make it. And so the other producers and myself of this show, we had the conversation about what happened. Um, why did this happen? And we knew that there were no other sisters that could help us answer these questions other than our two guests this evening. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Sister Dr. Treya Allen, University of Arizona, and my lovely, lovely sister Mary Roaf over there at California State. And, I don't even want to waste time. I just want you sisters to go ahead and get into this. And the expectation, as always, when you come to us, you raise the roof, you elevate our domes, and we're just ready to get this going. So just go ahead, do your thing, and we'll be back at the end for a Q&A.
Well, good evening, Live Black Experience, and everywhere that you are joining us from, whether that is the live broadcast or the replay. We're just excited to be back with you again. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Treya Allen. I'm at the University of Arizona and Pima Community College. Dr. Roaf?
Thank you. I love that, Dr. Sister Treya Allen. I've actually lost count of how many times we've teamed up. I absolutely love it. I'm Dr. Mary Roaf. I'm over actually in the Central Valley region, California State University, Stanislaus State, and for actually alumni of NAU and former faculty at NAU. So again, I echo Dr. Treya Allen's welcoming of everyone who's here tonight and who's going to be able to catch the replay.
Yes. So let's get into this good stuff. Dr. Roaf, go ahead and ground us, and you just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Ooh, thank you. So this was actually, I mean, we have so much with this. This was
so much.
Right.
And can we just pause really quickly?
Yes.
I know it's serious when you put your glasses on.
You know it's serious. It's like this presentation really created itself. I've been following Stacey Abrams, not as long as you have, Sister Treya, but definitely when she became the country's darling, right, in 2020 and handed up Atlanta, right, the Georgia to Biden and all of that. And so I've also been, and I even integrated her into my courses. I did a special unit when I was teaching in that fall, of 2020, and then go from that kind of apex to kind of coming down a little bit to reality. And so the bigger picture that we really want to frame this in, to put it in context, is not only did Stacey Abrams, I lose in quotation marks, the gubernatorial race in Georgia this go around, there were other Black women gubernatorial candidates and Senate candidates for the U.S. Senate. And
Absolutely.
none of the Black women in 2022 who ran for governor or for Senate won their races. And this really points to the title of the political oppression of Black women and the forms that that takes in the persistent difficulties and challenges, especially due to the fact that Black women are the single most consistently loyal block of voters for the Democratic Party, to the tune of Black women who voted in 2020, 93% of those Black women who voted nationwide supported Joe Biden, who absolutely could not have won without us. So there's a big disconnect.
Indeed. So as we get into this, I just want to provide background information. Stacey Abrams has been in this political game, I think, from birth. You know, her parents, her mom is was a college librarian, and dad was like a dyslexic factory worker. But they made it a point to actually take their 6 children to the polling station. They made it a point to show them what it meant to agitate, not just for the right to vote, but for that vote to actually count. And so from her time, you know, being born in Wisconsin and then the family relocating to Gulfport, I believe, Mississippi, she had always been in spaces and in places where her parents were really teaching her how to critically think about, well, what is this American project? What does it actually mean to vote? And in telling their children these stories, actually demonstrating why they voted in every election, whether it was national, local, even if it was just for the school board, right? And so just want to pause here really quickly and say that a lot of what we see around voting patterns is that we vote for the big stuff, but we forget that it's our local, these local races that actually shape the policy that informs our lives, right? Voting for president, absolutely important. But equally important is to vote for your attorney general. Vote for the judges who are going to be in your criminal justice system. Vote for the school board that will have, you know, policy making authority on what gets funded, what doesn't get funded, what gets taught. The CRT crisis, anyone, where we have whole school boards tearing things apart. And so Stacey Abrams having parents who were very much like every election is important really lays the foundation of what we see in her political prowess and her understanding of what things like voter suppression in the 21st century actually looks like. So I say this lovingly, she is not new to this. She's actually true to this. So in 1992, she's at Spelman and she creates this group. She co-creates this group called the Students for African American Empowerment. And these students were pretty, you know, in the early 90s, you know, we did not have some of the protections we had now. But these students actually go to the Georgia Capitol and they burn the Georgia flag because of this like die-hard commitment to Confederate memorabilia in spaces and places. So this happens in 1992. The creation of SAY, which is what their group is called, it was in response to the Rodney King verdict, right? And the dereliction of justice that happened in that case. So this is 1992. She's a recent college freshman at the Spelman University there. And then in 93, we get to hear her speak for the first time as like an 18-year-old at the anniversary of the March on Washington. So here's this beautiful Black child who is talking about jobs and peace and employment and education opportunities at 18 years old, right? So she doesn't just start, you know, we don't just meet her in 2018. Like from the moment that she was birthed, 1973, she was in the streets fighting alongside mom and dad, or at least just learning about what this looks like. Now, she goes on to finish her bachelor's degree, goes to get her master's in UT Austin, but then becomes a lawyer right out of Yale. And from there practices attorney. She was a practicing attorney for tax and levy law, I believe it is. 2006, she's elected to the Georgia House and is known immediately for her bipartisanship, right? So she's not like Democrats. She's like, yo, we need to fix this together. And she serves there for a good 10 years. But in that time, in 2010, she becomes the Georgia House Minority Leader. And she's also the first Black woman to do so in Georgia. And so she serves in that position for about 6 or 7 years. Now, during her time in that position, she creates this thing called the New Georgia Project, right? And under that project, she fights to enroll and register voters, about to the tune of 86,000 new voter registrations. And those voter registrations primarily happen in communities where there was widespread disenfranchisement, right? And so what does that look like in the 21st century? We'll get into that, but some of that was voter purging, or the direct match system, where if your name, your signature doesn't exactly match something in a state file line, that we can throw your vote out. We can harass you for potential voter fraud, right? That leads us up to her first run in 2018, where she has her first run for governor. And that's where this story kind of gets a little bit interesting. At the conclusion of her run, we know that she does not concede the election. And she says the reason why she doesn't concede is because to concede the election also meant that she agreed that the system that she was laboring in to actually make, this election possible was in fact just and appropriate. And so what we find out is that indeed was not the case at all. So here is baby Stacey at about 17 or 18 years old, making her first speech. I'm going to invite you all to look this up on YouTube, because I definitely want to make sure that we have time. It's about a 1-minute clip, but I definitely want to make sure that we have time to kind of break down some of the things that we're seeing when we actually did this analysis of, wait a minute, this is larger than Stacey, but also we're still doing this. So definitely want to make sure that you all have time to do that, and we'll figure out how to put it in the chat. So just some highlights from the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election. We know that 88% of Black men voted for Stacey Abrams. And that's, right in par with where, I'll let Dr. Roaf talk about that. 97% of Black women definitely voted for Stacey Abrams. Then they show out in the highest voting block across the state. So not just in Atlanta, not just in Macon or some of these other predominantly Black spaces, but across the state. In contrasting that, only about 25% of white women, both educated and non-secondary degree having, actually vote for her. What we find out is that she loses by 1.4% of percentage votes, which is roughly about 55,000 votes. So we also want to pause here and say that when we see percentages she lost by 0.07%, that could still be a significant number. 1.4% here is 55,000 votes. Now, in researching this, and after doing our research and trying to figure out what happened here, Stacey Abrams herself said real access to the right to vote isn't a guarantee, and that's a problem. So within the state of Georgia during that first election run, what we found out is that voter suppression, 21st century style, meant that a lot of absentee ballots were not even counted. So, voters could fill it out, but that was no guarantee that they could count. Access to being able to vote does not mean that you actually get to vote and then have that vote count, right? So we knew that lines during that 2018 So waiting lines in some of predominantly, communities of color were upwards of 4 and 5 hours. So if you have to work, if you have to pick up kids, if you have a night shift, you are taking a significant chunk out of your day, out of your time. There are no protections if you don't show up to work. But we all understood in 2018, that election was so like important. You had Black folks from across the country who were donating to her campaign, whether it was making calls, donating time, donating water or food or any of those things. We knew how important it was. Then you also had just regular old voter disenfranchisement. Polling stations were not adequately manned. The machines were broken. You had some cases of voter flipping, right? So you enter in Stacey Abrams and then the machine would turn it to Kemp at the time. And then my favorite, which is the purge and scourge tactics. So, we purge you from the voter registration list, even if you have made sure to re-register within 29 days of the actual election, that we say, oh, you're not valid here, or scourge, like, oh, you don't vote here, you need to go somewhere else. Or, I'm sorry, there's a mistake, it says you already voted, right? And we saw case after case of this. And so when Stacey Abrams' committee and her campaign actually see that this is an issue, they start to file lawsuits. Now, we know ultimately she came short of the 55,000 votes to be declared the new Georgia governor. But even more disheartening is that she didn't even make the 17,000 votes necessary to force a runoff in the state of Georgia. And when they start counting up all of the votes that were missing, like having to fight, court cases and filing suit just to have those votes count, not all of those votes were counted at all. And ultimately, she says in her 2020 book that we just came up short with the numbers. But what they did not, what they weren't willing to do was to just let this behavior kind of pass by, right? And so through litigation and the creation of organizations like Fair Fight in 2018, litigation and lawsuits, advocacy, organizing grassroots, we see then the work turns from Stacey Abrams just losing the gubernatorial race into we have something that is much larger and much wider that is happening. And it's so subtle and pernicious that we don't even recognize. I think, in her book, she talks about how there can be a 3,000-pound gorilla in the room, but you're so distracted by numbers or did Stacey win that we don't see all of the other mechanisms that are working in the room. So through this, we see her actually going through and, fighting through fair fight action. And so litigation, legislation, and advocacy, filing, court cases against the Republican, the Republican bloc in Georgia. But also, I don't think that I said this, during 2018, I believe Kemp was still holding office as the Secretary of State. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. And so he would not resign from that position. So it begged the question of how can you be running for the governor of Georgia, but then also still hold a very key position that, basically saw the outcome or legitimized or purged voters or disenfranchised voters. And now one of the court cases, the courts did not agree, but they did agree that there was voter disenfranchisement that was happening. Now, part of that was also poll workers who were just not educated on the political process and the voting rights process. So someone would come in and say, oh, I want to vote. They'd say, oh, I'm sorry, you can't vote. You're not on the list. They'd say, okay, well, then give me an absentee ballot. And you'd have in some cases where poll workers would say, well, we want to reserve these absentee ballots for people who will actually vote. and whose vote will actually be counted. Dr. Roaf, I was reading this and I was like, wait, what? For real people who are actually going to be, whose votes are going to be counted? Now, one of the people who got swept up in this was actually MLK and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s cousin, Miss Jordan, who at the time was like 92 years old, right? She gets swept up into this because they're like, oh no, you've already voted, and would not allow her to have like an absentee ballot. Like, that's just one case, y'all. So through Fair Fight, one of the things that we saw with Fair Fight is we actually turned the state of Georgia blue, and turn it blue in service of Biden and Kamala Harris getting elected in 2020. Now, this is extremely significant because Georgia was not a Democratic state at all. It had not been blue since around 1966. And even then it was like maybe sky blue. But in this case, it was super, super blue, right? And we know this is critical in Biden sealing, the presidency, right? There's some other things that are going on here. I invite y'all to do research because we will be here all night. But I'm going to pass it over to my good sis, Dr. Roaf.
Thank you, Dr. Sister Treya. So I was actually really surprised when I did the research on the outcome based on exit polling, voters are identifying demographics, et cetera, from this year's gubernatorial election in Georgia, because when Reverend Sister Bernadine and we all started kind of discussing the possibility of this talk, the question that was being posed, even by NPR, was, are they or aren't they? As in, are the Black men in Georgia going to vote for Stacey Abrams? Now, I also heard some rumblings and grumblings on social media that there was this kind of almost preemptive, almost like wagging of the finger. These Black men, hey, you better step up. And I understand, I'm not going to shy away from the larger framing of very vocal voices and platforms. They call it, you give a man a mic and a podcast, and they give him a mic and he's got a podcast, right? So there's some vocal echo chambers on social media where it's very easy for anyone to exploit and punch down on Black women and gain a significant following. So there was all of this swirling around, and yet the polls show that there was, I heard 80+% of Black men who voted in Georgia voted for Stacey Abrams. Of course, Black women overwhelmingly voted for Stacey Abrams. But when it comes to white women across, right, socioeconomic education levels, 72% voted for Brian Kemp. So there's not a lot of movement actually in terms of the subgroups and how they turned out in relation to actually both of the same candidates between 2018 and 2020. And I looked into some additional, very, very critical commentary on why during especially major elections does the entire country come out and look to Black people over and over and over again. We can't save this country. Everybody has to do their work. Where were the white women? Where were the white feminists? Where were the white women pushing all of the get out to vote when it comes to backing Black women candidates? I don't ever see them. And despite that, right, Black women keep doing what we do. We're not doing it because we're wearing a cape. People literally started bowing down at the altar of Stacey Abrams after the 2020 election results. speaking of her of almost like godlike status. And it's like, she didn't do it for you. She did it for us. And what's really critical here, in the state of Georgia, which is almost exclusively associated with the Atlanta metro area, only 28% of the electorate statewide is Black. And let's talk about systemic disenfranchisement. Even with that, white women, where you at? Again, I'm going to take it back to that core dilemma. Are white women going to continue to choose white supremacy and white privilege and anti-Blackness over gender equity? This in 2022, even after Roe v. Wade, putting bounties on women's head, and it's white women that they want to force to have children. I'm just going to keep it real because I don't have time to do otherwise. When are white women going to start choosing gender equity and relinquish at least enough of that white supremacy and that white privilege and that anti-Blackness? They're not really doing it yet. So again, it was like this, there's just a need to reframe this whole conversation about where are the Black men? No, where is everybody else, especially white women?
Yes, Dr. Roaf, can I jump in here really quickly because you just brought something up for me. There's this phenomenon where Black women, right, are great. They're so great. We love them and we call them pets. But the moment that we start having critical conversations around there's some things that are going on and we challenge system, we quickly move from pet to threat. And I think you see that a lot here with Stacey Abrams. Like the fact that she was America's darling, like, again, like we said, Stacey is not new to this at all. She has been championing these things since, 1973, walking alongside mom and dad, going to polls. So when she turned out and, did the work, her organization, A Fair Fight, and then working with grassroots and organizations to mobilize folks to actually fight for and to trust again an already corrupt system, we were singing her praises. I mean, there were so many editorials everywhere. Oh my goodness, Stacey Abrams does it again. And what she says is, she said, I didn't do this by myself, y'all. It was all of us who, but it's attributed to her. The moment that it becomes time for us to actually show up, right? And so, I mean, everybody, all humans in Georgia, we see a consistent pattern of some of these populations voting against their interest. I know we're talking about Sister Stacey right now, but for the 1.9 million of y'all who voted for Herschel Walker, what are y'all doing? Okay, tag, you're it.
Well, thank you. This is a really, really salient point. This is the pitfall of very, very we cannot afford to play token Blackness. I am your Negro politics. And I'm going to go there with you. Sister Treya has laid out, I mean, Stacey, she's also an accomplished author, and she really did at one point throw her hat in the ring. She really wanted to be seriously considered and selected as the VP candidate. Now, that's a whole nother presentation. And the Democrat, even the party machine, when I was in Arizona, I was a part of PDA. I was part of Progressive Democrats of America, who convinced Bernie to run, all of that. They knew that they always come back to Black women, and in particular, they're courting the Latinx vote that works in some parts of the country, but not in others, Florida. It's not a monolith. So they're like, we're going to have to throw the most loyal voting bloc a bone. And it was a slap in the face to me. I'm going to say that from my perspective. I'm in California. I know Kamala Harris's background in law enforcement. She called herself the top cop. She could have chosen a different career path. That's what, right? And I still supported it. Why not? That's the problem of playing token Black people in blackface politics, because then you throw anybody with a black face up in there and you get this dead heat between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. And that's an easy game to play. That's an old game. So now the Democrats and the Republicans, to some degree, they're just doing tit for tat for getting tokenized Black candidates. Stacey Abrams is way beyond. We can unpack that at a later time. Should have chosen her. I don't care. She should have been chosen to be on that VP ticket. And so that it's the tokenizing Blackness that we're seeing play out now in Georgia.
So, just because you said that, I just want to make sure that we paint a very clear picture of what these two gubernatorial races, like the map of voting, actually look like. Now, what you're seeing here is a sea of red. So this is both in 2018 and 2020. And I think this begs the question of the gap. Where are all y'all 2020 folks? And I'm sorry, this is not 2020, it's 2022. But where are all of y'all like blue folks that turned the state blue in 2020, right? So that's a real question that deserves a response, right? Especially if we're considering that we agree that some of the progressive measures that Stacey is putting forth, her bipartisan efforts, her intelligence, all of these things, if we agree that that happens, then where are all the people that turned the state blue, right? And so I want to walk back really quickly to this NPR and GPR, so Georgia Public Radio broadcast that, posited these, what do you call them? Like these headlines about Stacey Abrams having to cater to Black men, when really what we see is the statistics are pretty much dead heat, like minus 2 percentage points. When we unpack that, because we understand that the absentee votes were not counted, because we understand massive voter purges from Georgia's register of voters, and I'm talking in 2019, y'all. In 2019, this was happening. And then Fair Fight constantly going back to the court saying, yo, this is not okay. When we see these things, what we may be seeing is not even a Black men don't support Stacey Abrams. Clearly, that's not true. But what we do clearly see is the same folks who, in 2020 was like, it's time for a change. And all of these folks who are trying to separate themselves from the January 6th insurrection and Trump and whatever else was out there, right? So we know that even Brian Kemp did this as well. It still doesn't answer the question, what happened to y'all in 2022? Because Stacey has been pretty consistent. What happened to y'all in 2022 when we know that Brian Kemp has had his hand slapped by federal, prosecutors and everyone else? So what happened to y'all in 2022? One of the things that is constantly pointed out to me that Atlanta ain't Georgia. Not at all. So we see very strong voting blocks here that are blue, even in Columbus, around Savannah. So the Augusta, these major hubs of communities of colors. But what we don't see here is all these other counties that were primarily in 2020 blue. They're no longer blue. They are staunchly red. Right. And so that for us was like, I remember texting you, Dr. Roaf, and I was like, hey, something ain't right while doing this research. And so we can say a lot of things, but one of the things that we do want to say is that while she did not win in 2018, some of the things that we see, especially in Texas, the great country of Texas, is we had 17 Black female judges appointed to the federal bench, right? We saw some other key wins in other areas for people of color. So even though she did not win in 2018 or even in 2022, we also see this amazing kind of shift around what we consider and how we show up and how we fight not only for access to the vote, but for that vote to be counted. Now, if you saw our LBE on the tropes and stereotypes of Black womanhood, you'll really quickly be able to identify that the ways that we punish vocal, smart Black women is that we characterize them as angry Black women. We start to say crazy things